Welcome back to College 101. Today we are talking about job interview tips. This is continuing in the vein of career-related advice for college students or early career people. So check out the other videos I have about LinkedIn, about resumes, and hopefully you'll find this video useful here. Just before we start though, if you have any interesting interview questions you've been asked that really surprised you, let me know in the comments below so that everyone else can be even more prepared for their interviews in the future. So interviewing is very, very important as a college student because you have a minimal amount of experience. And so really getting to know you and who you are and how you work has to come through one-on-one interaction. They can't see projects you've done in the past too much. They can't see companies you've worked for and assume your caliber based on that. And this is a blessing and a curse. It's kind of a curse because once you have your first job, it's easier to get the others because they can say, oh, you work for XYZ, so you know about this technology, this process. Or if it was like a company like Amazon or Google, they say, oh, wow, you worked for a big company, you must be really good. It's a blessing though, because no one's prejudging you. They just have to look at your resume, decide to interview you, and then see what you're like. So making a great first impression is really important. And I'm going to share the tips and tricks I have for you, as well as some common things to watch out for. Before we begin though, first piece of advice, same as on your resume, and I should have said this for your LinkedIn profile, don't lie in an interview. Because even if you lied on your resume and you made it through and they didn't catch you, then if you lie in the interview, they're more likely to catch you. And even if you don't, if you get hired, they will eventually catch you. So don't lie in an interview. Okay, off my soapbox now. So the first thing I want to talk about is the STAR method for answering interview questions. A lot of interview questions are what they call behavioral questions, and they usually start with, tell me a time when, or tell me a time that you did something. The best way to answer that, and actually a lot of recruiting documents have the STAR sections written out so they can document them, is to follow this 4-step process: situation, task, action, and result. So let's break that down. The first part of a STAR answer is the S, the situation. This is giving them background. So this is telling them when it happened, what job or what class you were in, was it a group project, what was your deadlines like, what was the stress, things like that. It's setting the stage so that they know what context to take your story in. Were you a working professional? Was this in high school? Was this a college class? Give them some background. The T is for task, and this is where you get into answering their question directly with, what did I do, or what was I supposed to do? So if they ask you a question about, have you ever worked in a team, then the situation is, well, it was at this job. The task is, we were supposed to be completing this or doing this objective. So the task is supposed to be pretty direct. What were you doing and why were you involved? The action is the even more direct answer to their question. So if they said, name a time that you worked in a team or that you resolved an issue in a team, then you set up where you were, you set up what you were supposed to be doing, and then, they have implied that there was a conflict in this situation. So you can say what you did to resolve that conflict. I talked to each of the team members individually and divvied up the assignments, or I talked to one person who wasn't pulling their weight and helped them understand their position more, or things like that. It's the action, what you yourself literally did to remedy the situation. And then the result is, how'd it turn out? Hopefully positively if you're answering a question, though there are some interview questions that are negative, like, what's the biggest mistake you've ever made? Or what's a time when you made a decision and had to go back on it, or something like that. And so sometimes that result is negative, but either way, it's the consequence of what you did. So if you follow these 4 steps, situation, task, action, result, you should be able to answer their question fully, and they'll be able to follow you. You're going to tell a cohesive story that is logical and progressive, and they're not going to have questions while you're talking if you say, oh, well, I did this, and oh, it was while I was doing that, and it ended up like this, and we were supposed to be doing that. You're kind of jumping around the process, and no one's going to know what you're doing. One thing I will say with the STAR method is that these questions should be probably 90 seconds to maybe as high as 5 minutes. That might be a little long. I would say maybe 90 seconds to 3 minutes long in answers for these behavioral type questions. There are other questions in interviews that will be shorter. The other thing with these is that to tell them properly and answer them well, it sometimes takes time to organize your thoughts, and interviewers know that. So if someone asks you a question, especially one that you were kind of unprepared for, just say, yeah, I think I've got a great example, but give me a second to kind of figure out all the parts I want to tell you about. Or, I've never thought of that before. Can I have 30 seconds to think of the best example to tell you? And the interviewers are always going to say yes. And, try not to feel uncomfortable. Silences in an interview can be uncomfortable, but you've told them why you're being silent so they understand. So it's okay. Ask for a little more time and it'll go over well. I will say don't make your answer too long. Don't ramble on for too long because they may have follow-up questions. And so rather than, ramble on forever and ever trying to get every single part of the story told, tell them your answer within the STAR framework and then let them follow up and answer some of these more specific questions they might have rather than trying to guess what they might want to know. I will also say that for these behavioral type questions, you can usually be prepared. There are articles all over the internet telling you what the most common behavioral interview questions are. Some of them can even be broken down by company. These are the most common interview questions that Google asks or Facebook asks. So you can find these lists, and so you can pre-prepare your answers. The other great thing is that you can relate these back to things on your resume, so it's kind of like you have a cheat sheet. You don't have to worry about remembering all these things or writing notes on the insides of your hands to remember because you've got a full page note sheet right there for your interview. I will say for these top behavioral questions, maybe the top 10 or 20, have 2 or 3 experiences for each of them because you don't want to have one really great story and then tell it over and over and over again. They're going to say, wow, have you done anything else with your life? So if you can have some experience from previous jobs, from group projects, from classes, from clubs and organizations and teams, then, if you have maybe 10 experiences and they're going to ask you 3 or 4 questions, you should have it covered pretty well. Some of these most common questions are things like, tell me a time you worked in a team, disagreed with a coworker, disagreed with a supervisor, made a mistake, saw a safety issue if you're in like the engineering space, had to supervise a task or another person, things like that. And a lot of these questions are much more about soft skills than they are about hard skills. One tip along with this is that you can talk about school, but it's not as preferable as job experience. And talking about school for every single question is kind of a little bit of a red flag in an interview for a lot of people. In my resume review, I show you my first resume from my very first career fair when I was a sophomore. And even though I didn't have a lot of experience, I had enough that I could talk about it. And I was able to use examples from previous jobs, from lab assistant work as a student, and things like that are better than talking about school because everyone does school. As far as how to do well in an interview, I would say practice with a friend and then also practice with people who don't know what you do. If you only practice with people in your major or people you work with, they know exactly what you do. Practicing with someone who doesn't is useful because they'll ask you questions like, wait, what does that mean? Or what exactly did you do? Or, hey, that makes no sense to me. And that's because sometimes we start using a lot of jargon specific to our field. And if you do that and you're interviewing with like an HR person who's a general recruiter, they're not going to know whether to be impressed or not or what any of it means. And they might just say, wow, communicates poorly and X you out. So if you can practice with someone both in and out of your field, that would be really valuable experience. As far as how to show up for an interview, I would say it's always better to overdress than to underdress. So for the guys, I would say wear a shirt and tie and slacks. You maybe don't have to go all the way up to a suit, but you also don't want to be the only person that shows up for an interview in a t-shirt and jeans or a polo and khakis when everyone else is dressed up a little bit more than you. It shows respect for the interviewers, especially because sometimes they might be stuck in a shirt and tie or even a suit all day. So just, say, well, you've got to do this, so I've got to do it. It's part of the hoops you jump through in an interview recruiting process. For girls, I would say a blouse and a skirt or slacks, or you could wear a dress if you wanted. Whatever direction you go, make sure it's business professional, and it might even be what you might wear to work every day. I'm very fortunate that I actually get to wear a t-shirt and jeans to work every single day, but that's not true for a lot of fields or a lot of majors. This also matters to the company because you will often have to represent them, the person who's hiring you, to a higher manager, to an outside customer, or advisory board or something, and so they want to see that you can dress up nice and look nice and present yourself well. My last tips for an interview are keep in touch as much as you can. First thing you're going to want to do is send a follow-up thank you note within 24 hours, but not too soon. What I would recommend is always send it the next morning. And oftentimes in a recruiting process, you're going to have a point of contact who might not be the person who interviewed you. Maybe you interviewed with like a hiring manager, an engineering manager, or a technical person, and your point of contact is an HR representative. So what you can do is you can send them a thank you and say, thanks for all your work being my representative. Can you pass on this thank you note? And then type a thank you note and say, please pass that on to the interview panel. I really want to show my appreciation to them. Is this going to make or break your job opportunities? It's not going to get you the job, but again, if you're the only one who doesn't do it, it reflects poorly on you. So it's one of those hoops or courtesies or traditions that's part of the interviewing process. So always do that. It doesn't have to be long, but you can just say, thank you for your time. Thank you for your thoughtful questions. And I really want this job. Say, reiterate why you think you're qualified and why you want the job. And then thank them and close the note. So, 150 words tops, maybe, one small little paragraph. Doesn't have to be anything fancy, just keeps you at the top of their mind. And then after that, I would say try and keep a reasonable amount of contact on a reasonable timeline. So as part of the interview, if you can, at the end of every interview, I would say, when should I expect to hear back about this position? And a lot of times they'll say, anywhere from 2 weeks to maybe 6 to 8 weeks. And so I would honor that. If they say, we'll be making a decision in the next 2 weeks, then follow up with the recruiter in about 2 weeks and say, hey, I heard that they were going to be making a decision around now. Do you know if there's been any movement on this, if they're done interviewing, if they're still interviewing? If they say it's going to be 6 weeks, honor that and keep track of it. However, once you've hit that limit, if you send the email after 2 weeks and they say, we're not quite done, but we're going to be done soon, and all they say is soon, I would follow up maybe weekly for your week 3 and week 4, and then after that, if they're not really responding, there's not a lot of movement, dial that back to maybe a monthly email until the position is closed. And even after that, if you've kept in good contact, if you've been polite, stay in contact with the recruiter. Say, hey, what other open positions are there like this one? What other departments or locations are hiring for positions like that you know of? Because if nothing else, you're saving them time. They already know who you are. They already have someone who's interviewed you who can give them feedback on you and say if you're a worthwhile candidate. Because it could be that you were a great candidate and they would have hired you if it weren't for that one other person who was just a little more qualified than you. And so in that case, the company would love to keep you, and it'd be a lot faster to have you go do a 30-minute supplemental interview with another manager than to have to go through the whole process and read through 100 resumes and pick 8 people to do interviews with and line up all of those and wait another 2 months. So really, you're doing a favor to them as much as they're doing a favor to you if you say, hey, what other jobs are open? Especially if you meet them at a recruiting event like a career fair, you can follow up with them from semester to semester or year to year. Hey, we talked last year at the career fair. I hope you're coming back with company XYZ. I'd love to hear more about your positions and tell you the things I've worked on in the last year. It's a great, simple way. Send them a message on LinkedIn, send them an email, and keep in touch. There are 2 last pieces of the interview that I want to talk about that are important. The first one being the question they always ask at the end of an interview: what questions do you have for us? And that usually is a way for them to ask you and see what kinds of things you're wondering about. And there are 2 different kinds of questions here, and you have to sort of feel out the interview to know what to do. The first set of questions is things that are logistical. Oh, what hours do you work? How much overtime do you work? Is there any flexibility in the scheduling? I wouldn't talk about pay or specific benefits, how much vacation or things like that, but you can talk about the general work environment and work culture as it pertains to logistics. The other type of question, and I always suggest asking at least one of these, is a more directed question back to the interviewers to get them talking. My personal favorite question is to ask them, what is the one least favorite thing about the company? Or, if there was any reason for me to not work at your company, what would it be? Because that shows I'm trying to be open and honest about it. I'm not just desperate for a job, even if I really am, but I want to know. Because especially for early career hires, you are the most expensive employees for a company because, not to be rude, but your first 3 to 6 months or even first year, you aren't adding a whole lot of value to the company. So they're paying you $40,000, $50,000, $80,000 to not do a whole lot, just to train you basically. Sure, maybe you help out with some of the day-to-day small tasks, but they're not getting a huge return on investment. So the last thing they want to happen is for you to get 2 years of experience, finally become useful, and jump out the door as soon as you can. So the more questions you ask about fit and culture that show that you want to be there for the long haul, the more appealing you are to the company. You can also ask them questions about what they do at their location, big projects or contracts coming up, things like that that show you've done a little bit of research on the company. I think that again shows that you're actually interested in the job and you want to stay there for the long haul, not just that, oh, I've heard they pay well, or oh, I heard they hire a lot. The last thing I would say, especially if you know an interview really didn't go well, and try not to assume it didn't go well, but if you can tell that the interviewers got bored halfway through and they knew you weren't it, ask them for feedback. Or even if the interview just went okay, or even if you think it went good, ask them for feedback. Say, what can I do better for future interviews? Or, what skills could I develop to make me a better candidate? And again, that shows you're proactive, you're a hard worker, you really want to be successful and maybe even work for this company right now or in the future. So that's another great question to ask at the end of an interview when they ask you what questions you might have. Hopefully this was helpful and this will help you knock your next interview out of the park. And let me know if you have any additional questions, maybe, like I said, the weirdest interview question you've gotten that you weren't expecting and how you answered it. Thanks again for watching this episode of College 101 here on the College Guide. We'll see you next time.